stood on the edge of a digital revolution. The Internet, still better known as ARPANET, the U.S. Department of Defense's experimental network, which linked research labs, universities, and government facilities. It was a global web connecting places like MIT, Stanford, and Berkeley. By 1988, roughly 60,000 computers were exchanging data across oceans. Yet to most people, it remained a quiet mystery.
43 years ago, two computers in a laboratory at the University of California exchanged data for the first time in history. The experiment, carried out between two machines separated by a cable barely 4.5 meters long, inaugurated a new era in human communications. From that moment on, progress was unstoppable. The distances between communication points increased in parallel with the speed at which computers were able to send and receive information. Another important effect on society has been the expansion of the Internet and access for most citizens to the enormous amount of information it offers. Although humans have lived with computers for less than a century, they have become indispensable and no one can conceive of daily life without the use of these machines.
It was a time of discovery and excitement. Engineers experimenting with new protocols like TCP/IP, students dialing into remote machines on VAX computers and Sun workstations, and researchers envisioning a future where data flowed seamlessly. But hidden inside that excitement was a blind spot: security. A few imagined that someone might attack this new network. There were no firewalls as we know them today, no commercial antivirus software, and little awareness of what a network-wide infection could look like. Then, on Wednesday, November 2nd, 1988, a single experiment, one small piece of code, shattered that sense of safety. A computer program later named the Morris worm began to spread across the Internet, damaging machines, confusing experts, and forcing the young online world to confront a new reality. The age of cybersecurity had begun.
Former Cornell University graduate student Robert Morris was indicted today for planting a virus that infiltrated more than 6,000 computers across the country. Morris's defense includes that he intended only a low-grade prank. What he touched off instead was a rampant epidemic last November that infected a national defense network of computers, among others. If convicted, he could face up to 5 years in prison, a fine of $250,000, plus restitution to damaged parties.
Robert Tappan Morris was just 23 years old and a graduate student at Cornell University when he set in motion an event that would become forever remembered in cyber history. Technology wasn't foreign to him. His upbringing was practically surrounded by it. His father, Robert Morris Sr., was a well-known cryptographer who had worked at Bell Labs and later for the National Security Agency, specializing in Unix security. At home, dinner conversations weren't about sports or politics. They revolved around code, encryption, network vulnerabilities, and the future of computing. That environment likely shaped Robert's curiosity. At Cornell, he became fascinated by the Internet, by how many computers were out there, how fast the network was growing, and how interconnected systems could talk to each other. In the late 1980s, there was no dashboard or analytics tool to survey the Internet's size. Morris wondered, could there be a way to measure the network from the inside? He developed a program, later called a worm, that would replicate from machine to machine, probing connections, counting active hosts, and reporting its findings back. Importantly, he did not intend for it to harm data, steal secrets, or crash systems. He saw it as a kind of digital census, a research experiment, a very bold one. But experiments in complex systems rarely behave exactly as imagined. One small oversight, a decision about how the worm should check whether a machine was already infected, would prove disastrous. That bit of logic meant the worm sometimes reinfected machines unnecessarily. During his design process, Morris borrowed from existing network tools and security research, combining multiple attack vectors he had studied. He believed the worm would spread slowly, but still be manageable and within limits. but he underestimated how fragile the assumptions were in a sprawling, interconnected network, one built on trust and weak default settings. Even with all that, he expected his creation to be largely invisible, quietly gathering data without harming systems or drawing attention. Yet, intention is no defense when something goes wrong. Before long, the worm would just expose how little control a creator sometimes has over a networked system. The Morris worm had a deceptively simple goal: spread across the internet and tally how many systems were online. But the methods it used combined several techniques that individually were known to security researchers, and together formed an intoxicant. To start, the worm looked at configuration and trust-related files. It read files such as .forward, which controls mail forwarding, .rhosts, and /etc/hosts.equiv, which in Unix systems defined trusted relationships between machines. These files often let one machine log into another without a password, assuming trust. By seeing which machines trusted which, the worm charted seemingly friendly pathways to spread. The worm didn't rely on just one weakness. It combined three methods. The finger service in the buffer overflow allowed users to query information about who has logged in on a remote system, but its code lacked strict bounds checking. The worm used that to overwrite memory, inject payloads, and gain remote code execution. Sendmail was an email program used very widely in Unix systems. In debug mode, it accepted certain commands for diagnostic purposes. The worm used this mode to run shell commands without going through normal authentication, effectively granting it unauthorized access. Using a list of common words and passwords, the worm attempted to guess weak passwords on remote accounts. Because many users chose simple or common passwords back then, this method had a surprisingly successful rate. Once the worm gained access via any of these vectors, it proceeded to replicate itself. Inside a compromised machine, the worm copied source code files, compiled them locally, and executed them. It also propagated its logic outward, scanning for further targets, repeating the attack vectors, and establishing more copies. The worm was built to be self-replicating in a distributed fashion. To avoid obvious duplication, the worm included a check to see whether a machine was already infected, and would skip reinstallation most of the time. But due to a probability decision, roughly a 1 in 7 chance, the worm sometimes reinfected a machine that was already hit. That reinfection mechanism meant that multiple copies were present simultaneously, and they'd compete for CPU cycles, memory, and network resources. But over time, systems became overloaded, slowed, or even crashed. What was meant to be a quiet census became an uncontrolled epidemic. Within hours of its release on November 2nd, 1988, the worm began overwhelming systems. University labs reported machines becoming sluggish, military research networks saw unexplained crashes, NASA Ames Research Center administrators scrambled to diagnose a problem no one had ever encountered. By some estimates, about 10% of the entire internet, roughly 6,000 of the 60,000 computers, were infected. That may sound small today, but in 1988, those 6,000 machines represented some of the most important computing resources in the world: research databases, email hubs, and communication gateways. The human response was quite chaotic. Administrators disconnected networks, frantically shared patches over fax and telephone, and in some cases physically unplugged machines to halt the spread. The incident forced everyone to recognize that the internet, once seen as a safe academic resource, was now a battlefield.
Life in the modern world has a new anxiety these days. Just as we've become totally dependent on our computers, they're being stalked by saboteurs. Saboteurs who create computer viruses. The Defense Department, universities, and research centers are still recovering tonight from a computer virus that brought a nationwide network to a standstill. One of the institution's hardest hit was MIT. David Bowery reports.
It was first spotted at NASA Ames and Rand.
It came from California, maybe, traveled by electronic mail. It spread across America. How insidious was this virus?
Well, it spread very quickly.
There are reports in newspapers today that it has made its way to Europe and to Australia.
It arrived at MIT in the middle of the night. The students were safe. Their computers weren't.
Just ran. It would enter your machine, it would do its thing, it would go to other machines.
At MIT, 200 computers were infected. Across the country, the toll might be 6,000. It could have been worse.
We believe it was intended to spread more slowly than it did so that it wouldn't be noticed as quickly, which would actually have been more insidious if it spread out to a large number of machines and, say, held a surprise and did something.
Mark Eichen, student and part-time virus hunter.
Once we had it stopped, we were able to take it apart, sort of like dissect it and tear it apart piece by piece.
These three processes right here, these three programs, the SH with the parens around them, are in fact copies of the virus that are running there.
It's not really a virus, it's a code, a set of instructions, an act of sabotage that started on a floppy disk. This virus spreads by disk and by telephone. It's just a call away. And like a virus, it replicates like crazy.
Look at this, and look at this, and look at this.
And as it replicates, the code, the so-called virus, eats up large amounts of memory. It wipes out stored data or cripples the hardware. This virus clogged a system linking thousands of computers, but apparently did no damage.
It's benign. It's not malicious. It attempts to do no damage besides propagate itself, and that's why I think it's a warning.
The suspect? Somewhere, a dark genius.
I suspect it's an A student, a good A student.
So lost computer time, but no files destroyed. Just a thrill for the virus hunters and a warning.
My personal speculation is that this is somebody who is trying to warn people to say, it can happen to you.
Mr. President, we have not even been able to isolate the cause. The virus, if it is a virus, is like the common cold. It is everywhere, it is nowhere.
For the 10 o'clock news, I'm David Bowery.
Why was the worm so effective? Because the early internet relied on trust, and trust can often sometimes be exploited. The key vulnerabilities were the finger daemon overflow, sendmail debug mode, trusted host files, and weak passwords. A service meant for user lookups which lacked bounds checking, allowing attackers to overwrite memory and execute code. A convenient feature for troubleshooting, which eventually became an unintended backdoor. Unix systems often allowed passwordless remote access between friendly machines. Many users relied on short or dictionary-based passwords, making brute force guessing surprisingly effective. These flaws were common, but the worm exposed them on a global scale. Overnight, security patches and stronger authentication became urgent priorities. As the worm's trail was followed, computer investigators zeroed in on Robert Tappan Morris. Because the worm had been released from a relay point, from MIT, the direct attribution was tricky, but by analyzing network logs, timestamps, and behavioral patterns, law enforcement traced it back to him. At the time, the U.S. had recently passed the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act of 1986 to address the unauthorized access to computer systems, and Morris would become its first major test case. In 1990, the U.S. District Court in Syracuse, New York, heard the case. The central question, was Morris a malicious hacker or a misguided researcher? His defense argued that he had no intent to cause harm, only to explore and measure. His prosecution countered that lack of intent offered no protection for unauthorized access and damages. Morris was ultimately convicted under the CFAA. He was sentenced to 3 years probation, 400 hours of community service, and a fine of around $10,000. The case's decision was significant. The court held that even well-intended unauthorized intrusion and damage, in the form of resource depletion, system crashes, etc., could be prosecuted. The case sparked wide debate in the tech community. Some saw Morris as a tragic figure, a brilliant mind punished for overreaching curiosity. Others saw him as a cautionary example that researchers must adhere to ethical and legal norms. Universities and corporations studied the verdict closely and revised their policies on experimentation and responsible disclosure. Morris's fate also had a personal side. He completed a PhD later at Harvard and went on to a distinguished career in academia and industry. But the shadow of the worm case followed him. His name became forever embedded with the first big mistake of the internet era. The trial laid the groundwork for how the legal system views digital misconduct. After Morris, it was clear unauthorized access, even experimental, could carry criminal liability. The boundaries of acceptable research were reinforced. The worm's damage sparked immediate change. The U.S. Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency funded the creation of the Computer Emergency Response Team. CERT's mission was to coordinate incident responses, share vulnerable information, and provide rapid alerts. This was the birth of organized cybersecurity. Patching schedules, vulnerability disclosures, and emergency response teams all trace their origins to lessons learned in November 1988. Nearly 3 decades later, the Morris worm still echoes in today's security practices. The notion that just because a machine is on my network, it's safe, slowly gave way to never trust, always verify. The worm taught us that implicit trust is fragile. Today, zero-trust models assume every device or user could be compromised, limiting lateral movement and enforcing strict access controls. Modern systems rarely rely on a single security measure. We use firewalls, intrusion detection, anomaly detection, sandboxing, encryption, and multi-factor authentication. The diversity of the worm's attack vectors underscored the importance of overlapping defenses. The worm pushed software maintainers and system operators to adopt a culture of updates, vulnerability disclosure, and rapid patching. Delays or unpatched systems remain a top entry point for modern attacks, from ransomware to supply chain exploits. CERT and successor bodies evolved into complex threat intelligence communities. Today, organizations share indicators of compromise, IOCs, threat intelligence feeds, and coordinated defense strategies. Real-time monitoring and alerting are expected best practices. One persistent lesson is that curiosity must be tempered with caution. Researchers exploring new vulnerabilities or attack techniques must adhere to ethical frameworks, coordinate with affected parties, and avoid uncontrolled experiments. Many modern bug bounty programs exist to balance innovation with safety. The Internet of 1988 had tens of thousands of hosts. Today, billions of devices, servers, Internet of Things gadgets, mobile phones, sensors are connected. The risk surface is exponentially larger. The Morris worm is often cited in security textbooks, threat modeling tutorials, and cybersecurity history. The name Morris is remembered not just as a person, but as a symbol, the day the internet first had a wake-up call. This event continues to remain as an important reminder that technology evolves faster than our safeguards, and that curiosity, without caution, can have massive consequences. The Morris worm remains a turning point in cyber history. It began as a graduate student's experiment, but became the first great internet epidemic, proving that even a small program can echo across the world. Today, as cybercrime grows more sophisticated, from ransomware attacks to nationwide espionage, the worm's lesson is clear: Security is everyone's responsibility. The internet's strength is its connectivity, its weakness the same. Stay safe, Nullum Crimen, signing off.